listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. A new investigation into the biggest corruption scandal in Australian history is exposing what really went on behind the scenes of the Iraq War in the early 2000s. Formative years for many of us. It's uncovered the real human stories behind a scheme in which Australia funneled millions of dollars to a dictator.
Rocket attacks on hotel rooms, people having to run for cover in their budgie smugglers because they were swimming a lap in the pool, coming face to face with Saddam Hussein's henchmen, saving the life of an Iraqi and his family who had been targeted with an assassination threat, things like that. It's pretty crazy.
Investigative reporter Richard Baker joins Bension to talk us through the revelations in his new podcast, Secrets We Keep, Baghdad Nights. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Bension Siebert. It is Tuesday, August 6th.
Good morning, Sasha. First, let's head to Paris, where another fox has claimed gold. Noemi Fox taking out the kayak cross.
This is the biggest possible reward. It's unreal. It's just insane, and so I'm so proud of this whole campaign, whole journey.
That audio thanks to 9. That's 3 Fox Golds all up. No other medals overnight at the Olympics, but the Aussie men have qualified fastest in the pursuit cycling, and Melissa Wu has qualified for the 10-metre platform dive final at her 5th Games, along with teammate Ellie Cole.
We've also had some success in the athletics with discus thrower Matt Denny and pole vaulter Nina Kennedy both through to their finals, which will happen on Thursday. The men's water polo team has also made it to the quarters after a strong showing in the group stages, but they did go down to Japan overnight. While it is sad news for our Hockeyroos, they have crashed out in the quarters, losing to China 3-2. Now, something else that's been going on overnight, Bension, is this gender controversy in the boxing. It has continued. So a quick recap, the IOC has been publicly critical of the International Boxing Association over its disqualification of Algerian boxer Iman Khelif and Taiwan's Lin Yuting from its 2023 World Championships. This was after the fighters had failed gender eligibility tests, but the IBA never specified what the tests were. Now, those same boxers did satisfy the requirements to compete in the Olympics in the women's boxing, and both will actually be receiving medals after qualifying for the semis. Now, what's happened overnight? Reps from the IBA held a press conference declaring the 2 women are men. This was a direct quote from one of the representatives. They said the medical result, blood result, and the laboratory says that these boxers are male. The IOC and high-level officials from Algeria and Taiwan have both strenuously denied that these 2 boxers are men, saying they were born and raised as women and have passports saying that. So it's been this really nasty, toxic kind of discussion, unfortunately, around these tests. And the IBA has been critical of the IOC and vice versa. And it's worth noting as well, Khelif and Lin fought at the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. Neither won a medal and both competed without controversy. So what has happened in the 3 and a bit years since then to change how they qualify and how the IBA has changed how it determines who can fight in its competitions is yet to be determined. So that controversy just continues to roll on.
Australia's stock market has suffered its biggest plunge since 2020, falling by 3.7% yesterday. Investors here and across the globe have been sent into a panic following weaker than expected jobs growth data out of the US last week. The big crash was on the Japanese stock market, which had its biggest single-day fall ever. We spoke yesterday morning about how people were worried that the US Federal Reserve could have gone too hard raising interest rates, and that might push the country into recession. However, there was some more positive data overnight, so we'll see if that calms things this morning.
The head of Australia's spy agency says Australia is at risk from a mix of extremist ideologies after the national terror threat level was raised from possible to probable yesterday. Mike Burgess says a mix of religiously motivated, nationalist and racist violent extremism have prompted the change. ASIO says while the war in Gaza was not the cause behind raising what it called tensions in the community, it did admit it was a significant driver.
More Australians are embracing a more diverse range of extreme ideologies, and it is our responsibility to be vigilant.
That was Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speaking at yesterday's press conference. ASIO boss Mike Burgess said the agency had disrupted 8 incidents in the last 4 months involving acts or potential acts of terrorism.
Bangladesh's Prime Minister has resigned and fled the country after weeks of anti-government riots. Sheikh Hasina has been in power for 15 years in the country, but evacuated and will be given safe passage through India after student protests broke out in response to quotas for government jobs. Now, these protests started peacefully, but police and some supporters of the ruling Awami League party have been seen shooting protesters with live ammunition. There's been tear gas as well. At least 280 people, including 13 police officers, have reportedly been killed since the protests broke out. The country's military chief confirmed Hasina's resignation and departure in a televised address. Work is now starting to put together an interim government for Bangladesh.
And Kamala Harris has reportedly chosen her running mate with an announcement due in the next 24 hours. The presumptive nominee for the Democrats has been riding a wave of momentum since Joe Biden stood aside. But picking her potential vice president has been a delicate balancing act. It's reportedly down to 2 people, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Whoever she picks, they will appear together at a rally in Philadelphia this week to raise the curtain on their campaign together. And that'll kick off a 5-day, 7-city tour of the battleground states that are likely to decide the November 5 election. Bension, how exciting for Kamala.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for context, Tim Walz is this kind of folksy Midwestern guy who came up with the idea of calling Trump and his running mate JD Vance weird, kind of deflating the whole idea of these people as like huge threats to democracy, etc. Whereas Josh Shapiro, he sounds exactly like Barack Obama, which is incredible. He sounds like he's spent a lot of time in the mirror speaking like Barack Obama, but he's extremely charismatic. The one potential downside for choosing him is that he is a huge supporter of Israel, and that could cause a huge split within the Democratic Party.
That's true. And look, interestingly as well, we've had some new polls come out now. There's this guy called Nate Silver, and he kind of crunches all the numbers and he averages out what the polls are saying. Because as we know, think in Australia how many polls we get. Quadruple that in America by more, because there's state polls and there's national polls and they come out at all different times. So at the moment, he is claiming that Kamala Harris has crept just ahead of Donald Trump, according to some new polls. The race is neck and neck, but this number cruncher says that Harris is now leading Trump by 1.4 points in a national polling average. So it's, a good, I suppose, result for Harris and her campaign. However, it's still so close, and it'll be given the momentum she's had. I'm wondering if she was hoping maybe she had a bit more of a lead over him, but still got a few months. What is it? Less than 100 days. So time will tell.
It's a long time in politics, Sasha.
Very true. Thanks so much for being here for the headlines, Bension. Next up is your chat with investigative reporter Richard Baker about his fascinating new podcast, Secrets We Keep, Baghdad Nights.
For some of you listening, the early 2000s were the formative years, where we were just coming to understand the big picture of news and the world and politics. September 11, the Iraq War, the Prime Ministership of John Howard, these all loomed large in that picture. And during that period, Australia experienced its biggest ever corruption scandal. You might vaguely remember it. It was called the AWB Oil for Wheat scandal, and it involved Australians effectively bribing Iraq's then dictator Saddam Hussein to secure lucrative wheat export contracts. Investigative reporter Rich Baker was reporting on the scandal at the time, and today he's launching a major new listener podcast with new revelations and a deep dive into real people involved. Rich, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you very much for having me.
Many of our listeners might vaguely remember the oil for wheat scandal from the early 2000s. It's described as Australia's biggest corruption scandal. Can you remind us briefly what happened and why it's important?
Yeah, so Australia was selling millions of tonnes of wheat sort of between 1999 and 2003 to an Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, who was one of the, world's most kind of reviled people for that period of time. And doing it through this program, through the United Nations, basically, which was looking after Iraq's oil money so Saddam couldn't buy weapons and stuff like that, but they could buy food and things for the people. Anyway, the Australian Wheat Board was selling, as I said, millions of tonnes of wheat, making hundreds of millions of dollars for Aussie farmers. And what was happening was Saddam and his government had worked out a way to fatten up those contracts a bit through what's called a kickback. So getting extra money that they shouldn't have been getting in breach of United Nations sanctions, and ended up through us getting about an extra 300 million. And then in 2003, Australia joined the US and the UK in invading Iraq. And all of a sudden, we're going to war, we're sending troops to fight this guy that we've also been funneling $300 million to in breach of international sanctions. So it created a political problem.
Why are you making this podcast?
So I wrote as a younger reporter quite a bit when the scandal of this kickbacks started to hit the news in sort of 2005, 2006. I was a young reporter at the Age in Melbourne and was writing on it and found it really interesting because that decision to go to war was really controversial at the time. It wasn't supported by the United Nations. Some people described it as an illegal invasion. And it really split the Australian public because people are going, well, why is this in our interest to do this? And this corruption scandal really took us right into that process because we were intimately involved with the country we're going to war with through this trade. On a personal level, I think the thing that drew me back to this was I managed to procure a really infamous photo of the chairman of the Australian Wheat Board, so the highest profile guy there, who was for years personally involved in a lot of these dealings in Iraq, and he was also really tight with the Howard government, the Australian government at the time. And right at the height of this scandal, when a big inquiry was happening and it was a big media event, I got this photo of Trevor Flugie, shirtless, sweaty, got a chain around his neck, and he's reclining on this seat in a hotel room in Baghdad, pointing a revolver at the camera. And the way I wrote that up and the timing of it, it kind of summed up what everyone was perceiving as a cowboy kind of culture there where, do whatever it takes to get a deal. And it changed Trevor's life forever, and it changed how people saw that scandal. And it occurred to me that I wrote that story and sort of presented that image of him without really talking to him and getting his side of the story about what was going on. And I just thought if I could go back and kind of link things to that photo and grow from there, we might learn more about, well, what's it like to be the poster child for the biggest scandal ever in Australian corporate history, and have the guns of all the law enforcement and government agencies that, only 18 months earlier you'd been a trusted insider. Now you're, the most wanted man, so to speak.
Did this process give you a sense that kind of a simple sounding story was more complicated?
It's been the most challenging sort of podcast or long piece of journalism that I've ever done, simply just because it is a sprawling story, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of avenues you could go down. So you've got to make really good decisions. But when I took it back and looked at, well, we're hearing from voices from Trevor and a couple of other guys from the Wheat Board who were wheat salesmen who were trusted and positioned by our government to go into post-war Iraq to stop our great friend and ally, the Americans, from stealing our wheat trade office. That's a really simple starting point, and it's kind of in your head instantly, hang on, are these guys our friends or our enemies? Or they're our friends in this context, but in that context, they're our bitter enemy. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I always think having people who are there and people who can give us a window into the complexity and take us into new places makes these stories so much more accessible. So it's really geared towards following these journeys and some of the situations they get themselves in. You know, like there's rocket attacks on hotel rooms, people having to run for cover in their budgie smugglers because they were swimming a lap in the pool, you know, coming face to face with Saddam Hussein's henchmen, saving the life of an Iraqi and his family who had been targeted with an assassination threat, things like that. It's pretty crazy.
But what I mean about complexity is that often in journalism, especially when we're talking about a corruption scandal, it feels as if there are kind of simple villains. And it sounds to me like that's not what this story is about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's 100% true. Like we do in the media, I think, like to present stories. And I think that's maybe what I was doing back at the time when I wrote that story in a certain way. Like, you know, how can we make this digestible? Good guy, bad guy, you know, black, white. Truth is, and if you look at your own life and situations that happen there, there's a lot of grey. And I think we do a disservice to our audience and to the community in general when we get too scared to delve into that grey or too afraid to wade into complexity and then try and sort it out and make sense of it and go, well, on the one hand, you know, if you see it this way, it could be bad, but then you look at it that way, what other alternatives were there? What would you do? You know, so you put yourself in that situation. And the truth is often there aren't any simple answers or solutions. So that's definitely one of the reasons, you know, that attracted me to doing this. It was an opportunity to, I guess, try and showcase that we shouldn't be afraid to embrace some complexity.
Many of the listeners to this podcast will have had the experience of growing up with sort of John Howard as the Prime Minister of their teenagehood or their youth. You managed to interview John Howard for this series and ask him about going to war in Iraq, which was obviously one of his most controversial decisions.
That was probably the most difficult foreign policy decision my government took. And it was very unpopular.
Was that a tough sell to get that interview?
No, it wasn't too bad, actually. And, you know, for someone who's, I think, 85 or so, his mind's very sharp still. So, you know, I couldn't really, tried to catch him out on a few things or whatever, as we do. But he certainly handled himself really well. And I got an insight, I think, into, you mentioned the, Iraq war and that being such a big decision. And he said it was, and he took us into, I guess, the backdrop to that. And that kind of started with him being in Washington, D.C. on September 11 and seeing that unfold there. And that really reshaped the whole national security landscape for America and for Australia. And I think the whole world is still dealing with the ramifications of what happened next, after that. And so it's highly relevant today, with Australia's relationship with America and things like that. We've only gotten tighter.
Do you think that the way that Australia deals with scandal in general has changed over that period?
I don't think we do international corruption very well here. I think we have a problem with prosecuting it. I've written on other bribery scandals and things overseas, and the law is quite untested there, and it's really complicated and it's murky, and the burden of proof's hard, and getting information out of other countries, say when it's important people over there have been the recipients of bribes or kickbacks, well, are they really going to give up their own ministers, to put some salesman in jail here or whatever? So yeah, we have a problem with it, and then things just take forever through the legal process, and then naturally media lose interest, and often what can be a great fuss and nonsense and seem like the biggest thing in the world fizzles out. And that's where I wanted to follow this through, because it was a massive circus, and then it just eked away, and putting all those pieces together, and you look at, well, actually some people who were just trying to do their job, like, you know, there's a federal police detective who lost his career because he tried to build a case, and all of a sudden the politics of this changed, and that wasn't important anymore. And the more he pushed, the more he got pushed out.
Richard Baker there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. The first 2 episodes of Rich's podcast, Secrets We Keep Baghdad Nights, are out from today. You can find it on whichever platform is playing you my voice right now. There'll be new episodes every week. And before you go, we put all kinds of exclusive The Briefing content on our socials. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you then.
Listener.